Good evening, if you're watching this live, and if you're watching this in the playback, good whatever time of day it happens to be there now. As Cooper mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the gamification of threat modeling using OWASP Cornucopia. Now, yesterday, Brooke Schoenfield did a talk titled Great Threat Modeling Experience. And then he was joined by Azar for a talk on Agile Threat Modeling with Sebastian Delena Snyder, who was sort of overseeing that. These are all incredible folks in the threat modeling world and whose work you should definitely go catch up on. If you haven't watched it live yesterday, do yourself a favor and go watch the YouTube afterwards. Today, I'll be taking you down a parallel path using one of the OWASP projects I'm very keen on, which is Cornucopia. So firstly, who am I? Well, just 3 takeaways from a very busy slide. I apologize for that. The first thing is I'm really, really into this community. I'm fortunate enough to have been elected to represent the OWASP community globally on the board. I've been a DEF CON goon for over a decade now. Been involved with Black Hat for nearly as long. Usually on the other side of the camera, though. How to contact me? There's my email addresses, Grant at Secure Delivery, if you want to ask a commercial question. Otherwise, if it's to do with the foundation, which I hope most of your queries will be, please reach out to me at the OWASP.org email address there. And of course, Twitter or wherever else, pretty much everywhere else, I'm at REWTD, Root Demon. And then the last thing you can take away from this very busy slide is that I've done this for a long time and seen a lot of the iterations of how we do things as we move through. So hopefully I can bring some of that to this talk today. Just briefly on the commercial side, my company, Secure Delivery, I'm one of the founders. We're an AppSec-focused company, and it's our mission to try and meaningfully improve application security practices throughout the industry. We've been trusted to deliver assessments, guidance, and training for some of the biggest and most innovative companies out there. And there's a couple of shout-outs to those companies down at the bottom there. On the foundation side, this deck, obviously, I use quite a lot to talk to, or the basis of this deck I use a lot to talk to other groups. Hopefully you know all about OWASP, but if you don't, we are both a project organization and communities, and there's tons of projects, 150 projects, or more than 150 projects, open source that include the top 10s. Yes, there's more than one, and include some of the greatest tools that I've ever used, like OWASP SAP, and SAM and ASVS, which we use all the time. We're also a community organization, which means that there's a chapter in many tech cities. There's probably one near you. And if there isn't, it's probably time for you to reach out and start one. We also have conferences like this one, both online and in person, back in the days when those things were permissible. So keep an eye out for conferences happening nearby. What do I mean by threat modeling? I'm gonna dive in and just, like, this is a quick overview slide of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about what threat modeling is very briefly, just so that everyone has a context. We're going to talk about what that looks like at pace. And by pace, I mean the delivery speed of the organization. We're going to talk about Cornucopia, exactly what that is, where the name comes from a little. And then we'll do some practical stuff, some hands-on things. So whenever somebody says threat modeling, I can't not hear Adam Shostak's voice in my head going through spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. And he does that so fast because he says it all the time. Stride is probably the go-to method for most organizations that are doing threat modeling. It's 21 years old this year. It's still very well used. Adam actually did a write on its 20th year last year in dark reading. I'll probably have a link for that at the end for you. But basically, Stride is about spoofing, which is pretending to be something that you're not. Tampering, which is altering data in some way, like giving yourself more in-game money or whatever it is you're doing. Repudiation is proving who did what. Information disclosure is about exfiltrating data. Denial of service is preventing normal usage. And elevation of privilege is really sort of the crown jewel. That's what all attacks are trying to achieve, gaining access, more access than what they should have. Threat modeling, like Stride, happens in a very waterfall-y type way, generally. Waterfall environments are all using Stride, and you can do Stride in Agile. But we used to do Stride predominantly when we were doing waterfall, which is a very linear process, right? You go requirements and blah, 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 all the way through to deployment. You get one shot, and really only one shot right here, to really discover threats before you've spent time and money building things. And this is the point at which you can actually prevent something from happening before it ends up in prod. If you miss something, it ends up in production, and it either iterates through or you're patching something in a place you don't want to be. Now, in the agile world, which is always this little figure of 8, we only really get a chance to change things like we did in the waterfall method over here, right? This is the point at which time during planning and as you move into coding, that's when you can actually make decisions about, potential threats and how to mitigate against them. But this loop is a small release, and we get to refine each time we go through it with input that we gather from like here or here, and well, actually here, everywhere. So with an agile world, we get to do threat modeling a lot more frequently. Now, talking about frequently, threat modeling is all about time. Literally, we do it at design time. So we design for security in the design phases of our iterations, but it takes time to do. The larger the functionality that we're looking at to try and threat model, the more time it's going to take. And as our products evolve, so must our security understanding also evolve, which means that it changes over time. I believe this leads to a couple of issues. So firstly, when do we get security? So as a security guy, if I'm acting as a security individual on the security team, when do I get my hands on the designs that developers have for products they're going to produce? Is it before they started writing code? Not usually. And if it is, then I become this blocking phase before they can start. So I'm holding up delivery. Pretty much always that's going to happen. Threat modeling. The sooner the better, but never too late. My very good friends, Stephen and Avi of the OWASP Threat Modeling Project, on when threat modeling should ideally happen. Because this doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't know, right? Do it soon as you can. Just don't make sure it's not too late. And that's true. The second problem it comes up with is it takes too much time. So how much time is enough time to have invested in this process, in the threat modeling activities? Well, this quote comes from Adam Shostak's blog on magical approaches to threat modeling. And in it, Adam asks for a fourth option to the 3 magical approaches that he describes. And that fourth option is going to result in not too many threats. So hopefully we can come up with some ideas of how we can get to an answer for this, right? So a fourth approach to doing threat modeling that don't cover it. The question I have is, though, when do we stop looking for additional threats? The last one is inaccurate models. So are our threat models going to be good enough, right? They change over time. When do we have a good enough threat model, and is it going to be good enough? For that, I've got a couple of quotes. First one is from George Box, who says that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. He goes on to say that the question is the model good enough for this particular application? So the answer, I think, is in that quote. We need to make sure that our threat model is good enough for what we're trying to achieve. So a good enough model is what we want to have. And we need to build that model using whatever time we can afford. And we need to do it as early as possible in the process as we can. So given this, I like to do the earliest possible in the story scrubbing or backlog grooming or whatever phrase you want to use to describe it. Now, Mike Cohn coined the phrase backlog grooming in 2005. Call it whatever you want. But it's before stories are added to a sprint to be worked on. It's where you get to define the acceptance criteria. Which brings me to my second step. It's time-boxed. Backlog grooming or story scrubbing is a time-boxed activity. So it happens anyway. It's limited in duration. We only spend so much time doing the grooming. And we already expect to have non-functional requirement outcomes from that process. So it fits perfectly at that point. We also stop when we can build the thing that we need to. So when we have enough data, enough information to fulfill the acceptance criteria, remember, we can iterate. We can go back on it. We can do more of it later. So talking about Cornucopia. So Cornucopia is a game built on a number of really, really well thought through projects. They've leveraged things like the ASVS, the SCP, and App Sensor from OWASP. They've also pulled in things like Safecode and MITRE's Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification. So the basis for Cornucopia is some really good, solid thinking that's happening both within the foundation and with entities outside of it. Now, I am not as heavily involved in Cornucopia, the project, as I probably should be, or as I will probably end up being. Colin and I have talked about the next iterations of Cornucopia and what that might entail. For example, we already need to start looking at what we're going to do with the new versions of ASVS to make sure that we tie Cornucopia into that. These projects being the basis of Cornucopia mean that Cornucopia does have to evolve, and it will evolve as those projects gain more knowledge and become better at what they're doing. So what do you need to do in order to start doing some threat modeling? Well, perfect world, I'll have a architectural design of what it is we're going to build, and I'll have some data flow diagrams. That perfect world is almost never, in my experience, the actual perfect world, because we'll have something that represents the design as it was envisioned before it was sold as being something we're going to go build. And we'll have some rough understanding of data flow in that design. And those two documents will probably fairly closely overlap and fairly closely correlate with each other. But don't get hung up on having them or on having them accurate, because the reality is what you really need in order to do threat modeling is you need some time to play, because it is a game and you're going to need the time for it. You're going to need as many folks who are involved in building or testing the features that you're going to be looking to threat model as you can possibly get your hands on and put into your room together or into a virtual session together. And you need a will to actually get stuck into it, because it's going to take a bit of time and effort, and the outcomes are going to result in more work. So you're going to be doing work that's going to produce more work for you. So as long as you have those three things, time to play it, the folks that are involved in building or testing, and a will to actually make threat modeling happen, it will happen. Tomorrow evening, I'm actually doing a threat modeling masterclass with a company called Agile Stationery, who are trying to help deal with threat modeling using these gamifications in a smarter way now that we're all distributed. So I'm very curious to see how that masterclass goes, and definitely I'll be updating slide decks for the future with that. And feel free to ping me on Twitter to find out how it went, and I'll be sure to let you know. So outputs of some traditional threat modeling exercises. Well, this is a good threat modeling template. This traditional threat modeling template gets you a rigorous model with some possible threats. It gets you some great insights into the diagram state of the application, so the application as it was drawn up or as you were looking at it before. And it gives you a fairly good understanding, an improved understanding of the data flow as we anticipate it to be. Now, all of this is happening in design, and it's happening up front. It doesn't really give us the data flow as it is happening. It doesn't really give us the actual state of the application as it runs. It'll give us the diagram state, and it'll give us some anticipated data flows. This template, as I said, is a good one. It comes straight out of the OWASP Threat Modeling Cookbook, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. Again, there'll be some links at the end for you. Agile threat modeling, though, the image that I have there on the right-hand side of the slide is actually the score sheet, the scorecard for Cornucopia. With Agile threat modeling, what we actually want to do, we're going to use the score sheet because we're going to, I mean, it's a game, we have to have winners, so we're going to have to keep score. But what we're writing down in those lines that are under each of those colored bars are going to be stories that'll have some acceptance criteria, because security is a non-functional requirement, remember. And we'll have those stories that we will either be able to put directly into the backlog as these are items that need to be done, or these will be things that we need to add to existing stories before we start work on them. So they will be the NFRs of those stories. We'll get some context around some functionality in the code for security. So everybody who's going to be working on the code will now have some understanding of what the impact this piece of code is going to have from a security point of view, and also an idea of what they need to look out for as they're building it. as a completer side, we'll probably end up with much more accurate data flow diagrams and much more accurate diagram states of how the application is going to be built through the process. Because as people start talking about things, you'll see that they will update the slides, they'll update the drawings that we now have on that virtual whiteboard or the physical whiteboard in the room. So the real outcomes from proper threat modeling is, well, let's start off with threat modeling can get really academic. And it can't be academic. It shouldn't just be purely a theoretical thing. It needs to change the system to be useful. So we need to make sure that we identify the issues, that those issues get onto the backlog, and then we need to get product owner sponsorship for the stuff that we think is important so that it actually gets fixed. So how do we go about doing that? Well, Cornucopia. We use a deck of cards. So let's take a look at those cards. And in fact, I have a bunch of them here, different versions of the cards. In fact, there's a version from Blackfoot, who did the first deck of cards that you could actually go online, just ask for a copy of it. And I mentioned that they are stationary earlier. They've got a nice giant size deck of cards, which is kind of nice because it's about the same size as the elevation of privilege decks. But in the deck of cards, there are a number of suites. And we're going to take a look at them. The first suite is the one I've got up here. It's authentication. And authentication is, of course, all about who you are. So identity is the key component here in authentication. And this maps really well to the spoofing and repudiation aspect of Stride. So Cornucopia does also have a way to map back to the traditional threat modeling that you might be used to doing, or that your security team might expect you to be doing. So anything authentication related is going to map back to spoofing and repudiation aspects within Stride. Authorization, the second deck in the deck of cards, is all about what you can do. And this kind of maps back to Stride's elevation of privilege. But authorization is a mapping of roles or user characteristics that tie into features or aspects of data that you're allowed to touch. So authorization, another key aspect. Anytime you're talking about can a user do something, should a user be allowed to do something, you're talking about authorization, and you need to bear in mind what that authorization model needs to look like. Session management is the next suite, and session management is often how we map the who you are and what you're allowed to do over a period of time. Generally, we're talking about web applications. Generally, there's some kind of session, some kind of way that you don't have to keep logging in for every action you try to take. And all of the mechanisms behind making that work is included in session management. Session management generally deals with, from a Stride point of view, possible denial of service attacks. So it's to stop people from knocking you out of the system while you're currently logged in doing something, to make sure that you have access for a period of time, depending on the type of activities that you're trying to take. Data validation and encoding helps deal with tampering to some degree. It is also a key aspect of almost everything on the top 10. Whenever we talk about the top 10 and how that maps back to activities that developers should be concerned with, data validation is about not trusting user input, and encoding is about ensuring that anything that you're going to be outputting to another system is safe for that other system to consume. Generally, you want to be very aware of concepts like threat boundaries or trust zones when you're looking at data validation and encoding. Anything that crosses a trust boundary, that's something that should be either validated because it's coming in or encoded because we're putting it out. Cryptography, which kind of helps combat information disclosure. And cryptography is all about the secrets. So whether that's the securing data in transit between the user and the web service, or between the web service and a backend service of some kind, or between the backend services and some database components, or whether that's about storage in the database, or whether that's about how we put things into cookies. Cryptography is all about making sure that secrets remain secret. I kind of like to think of these as the OWASP top 5, which aren't really a thing, but they kind of cover the top 5 important things, the top 5 areas that you need to be focused on, need to be aware of when dealing with any application that you're building. But what about that last suite? That last suite in the bottom right there? Well, that's Cornucopia, which is the Trump suite. And the Trump suite aims to cover a bunch of things, all of the things that possibly aren't covered anywhere else. So Cornucopia's Trump suite in the game itself will also act as a way of elevating to still win a round, even though you possibly don't have the right cards for that round. You can still get around it with this Trump suite. It also adds a lot more gamification to how we play. So how do you actually play the game? Well, there are 9 steps, broadly speaking. And it starts with filtering the deck because we may not want to cover all of the cards. There's a large number of cards. There's ace through 10, jack, queen, king. So 13 cards in each suit, 6 suits. So there's 60 cards across the board. Maybe more. Math's not. It's too late for math. So we might want to pre-sort the deck, take some cards out and ensure that we're only, because the thing that we're working on doesn't have any user inputs, so we're not going to worry about data validation. There's no authentication happening here because that's in a separate module that we know is taken care of. So we're not going to deal with authentication. We know the users are properly authenticated. When you filter out cards, just be aware that you are filtering them out. So you're limiting what you might possibly see as a threat somewhere in the system. So just be aware that you are doing that. We do it, though, because of time. A game can take a long time, depending on how much discussion is had between each card. You deal out the deck, make sure everybody gets the cards they want. You want to take whatever's left of the deck, whatever is being discussed, and distribute that as equally as you can amongst everyone who's playing. Then you need to play. And you'll look at an app, somebody who gets to go first, and there's a really cool Chiwazi little phone app that you can download and use that will help you to pick who gets to go first. Or alternatively, you can pick, I don't know, the person with the longest beard in the room gets to go first. I generally tend to win that. Or you can pick some other random reason. The youngest person in the room, the oldest person in the room, the person who's been on the project the longest or the shortest. That person will look at the app, select a card from their hand, and then play it. And the playing of that card is step 4. At that point, you will describe what you think the attack is. So you'll read what's on the card and you'll say, I think this applies to our application because if I did this or that, wouldn't I be able to somehow cause this outcome? And it's literally just about using the tools that Cornucopia provides. So on each card, there is a list of the various ASVS or other projects that Cornucopia calls out to. And using all those details and the information that's on the card, you can then talk through a potential attack scenario. The reason you're talking through that attack scenario is because, and this is crucial, you have to convince the rest of the players that your attack is a valid attack, that what you're saying is feasible. Or at the very least, they can't rule out that it's impossible. And if you manage to get away with it's not impossible, then the item that's going on the backlog is verify that the thing that Grant came up with can't actually happen. And it's still a backlog story item, and it still scores you points. You score, yes or no. Everybody goes through that same process. Step 7 is about following suit, which means that whatever card was played by the first player, the next person has to play a card that matches that. It's as simple as that. At the end of the day, at the end of the game, when everybody's played and you've gone through all the rounds and you've used all your cards, or you've run out of time and you've decided, because you're time boxing it, you decide that that's the end of it. At that point, you need to award the prize. And there should be a prize. There should be something. Maybe it's you get to wear a crown for the day, or the product owner buys you lunch, or I don't know. It depends entirely on your team. Maybe you're exempt from having to deal with build breakages for a week if you win the game of Cornucopia. There should be some reward for having won, because otherwise there's no competition. And remember, it's important that you're allowed to cheat, because it's a game. And hackers are not going to be very gentle with your system. They're going to cheat. They're going to find sneaky ways of getting in. So you need to start thinking sneakily as you're playing. And that's an important aspect of the game, right? Just don't get caught cheating. And then the last step, number 9, is to follow up. Those items we've added to the scorecards need to end up on a backlog somewhere. They need to get put into Jira. They need to become tickets. We need to do something with them. And then we need to make sure that they've been tagged as having belonged to a threat modeling session. And possibly even if you're doing it from a compliance point of view, you might want to tag which threat modeling session it was specifically associated with. So that's all tied up neatly and nicely. There's a video explaining that. The suits are broken down just like regular cards, 2 through ace. On each card is an attack. The lower the card, the easier the attack is to defend. The higher the card, the harder the defense. And just like in poker, aces are high. But here, that means you get to devise a new attack for that suit. So that very short piece of a 15 minute video, the whole video end to end is 15 minutes. It'll take you through the whole game. It'll give you a bunch of examples. And this was very, very, very kindly put together by a company that I'll talk about a little bit later, who's done a fair amount of threat modeling with me. And they've done a really good job at making this something that they can get out to all the developers. And you can obviously see what I was doing during lockdown, and it sure as hell wasn't getting anywhere near my razor, or barber for that matter. So the company that actually put together that is a company called RBI, and that's Read Business Information. They're a division of RELX, so they're a fairly large company, one of the large companies that you've never heard of, or probably have never heard of. But they have about 1,500 developers to that 15,000 employees, about 1 in 10. And that's too many people for me to be able to go out and actually have a session with and train. And the important thing about Cornucopia is that it isn't a game that security plays with developers. It's a game that developers play. Now, they do need to learn how to play it. And that video that you saw was one of the things that RBI did in order to get the knowledge out there in the world. The other thing that I did was I put together a series of white papers actually started off as being an email. Ironically, an email to one of the Scrum Masters who was arranging a training session in the Netherlands. I was in Amsterdam at the time. And unfortunately, I didn't realize that the team was all distributed. So I'd come across from the UK, but the team was all over Europe. So we weren't going to be able to sit in a room anyway. So I wanted to put together a sort of a how-to for her to actually run the session. And when she printed it out and bound it and handed it back to me, I realized it was actually almost a book. So at some point, I might actually just publish that as a bound work or as a PDF that you can grab hold of. But it's important that you get the knowledge out into the developer world about how to actually put together a game, how to run a game, how to play the game, and have developers do it. 1,500 developers, too many people for me to try and train. RBI has some really hard problems to solve. Most of their problems are data related. Portions of their business provide transaction filterings to most of the world's top 10 banks, so it's high volume, highly data driven, very sensitive data generally. And they come from a world, they're born out of a world where they were a lot of smaller businesses to start with. So they're used to working very insulated, very agilely, very, very quick. But at the same time, they need to take into account that they are a large organization and the data they're gathering ends up being gathered into these large data stores. And something happening in app 1 could possibly have an impact on data that is completely unrelated or somewhere else. So they don't want to lose their agility, but at the same time, they do need to do something about security. And this worked really well for them. So why do we do this? So the key outputs, the advantages. Why do I use Cornucopia? Well, it's close. It's close to where it's happening, close to devs are doing it. So traditional threat modeling tends to happen at an elevated pace in security teams without devs being involved, or possibly with devs being involved, but maybe after they've already done the implementations, or without the context for developers as to why security is asking all these questions. It's smart. It's incredibly educational. It allows the security team to provide all the knowledge that they might need to give to developers, without having to have them sit down and go through, a PowerPoint presentation, the checkbox at the end. It's effective. Things actually get seen and fixed, combining the competitive nature that developers generally have and the practical and developer-aligned view on areas of concern that Cornucopia brings to it, and how it's a part of your story scrubbing process. It's a very effective tool. It does exactly what you would expect it to. I've got there addictive, and possibly addictive is not the right word, but it does become natural. It becomes something that developers just automatically seem to do. And eventually you get to the point where those scrubbing sessions only happen at the epic level rather than a story level, because devs, as they start working on stories, will automatically start to add little brackets, TM brackets, acceptance criteria to stories before they start working on them. So, or as part of what QA is doing with the story, they'll be adding a little bracket, TM bracket, threat modeling tag to acceptance criteria that they're adding to a story. And then QA will obviously pick that up and look at it as part of their quality assurance. It works really well. Cornucopia, well, the whole quote is threat modeling with Cornucopia empowers engineers to expand their application security knowledge through thought-provoking challenges, which in turn allow them to move fast, more securely. This quote is by Jeff Jenkins, who's the CISO at Reed Business. Jeff has one of the hardest jobs. Being the CISO of an organization that has as much data in its hands as RBI does is difficult. And allowing developers to deal with threat modeling on their own terms, took a fair amount of faith. But it's worked for them. It's worked really well for them. So how do we make it work? The first step is use the decks. Don't just deal down through the decks. We actually had a team try and do that. It doesn't work. You have to play the game. If there's no gamification happening, there's no challenges happening to what you say the threat might be, then there's no further thought. And quite often you'll find that the threat that you put down isn't necessarily the threat that ends up going on the backlog, because you'll find, wait, there's actually a bigger problem. There's a whole area that we need to look at that's far more interesting. Change up the game. Not all features need to be modeled. Perhaps you can avoid modeling some of the features. As I said earlier, with RBI, we started moving to a point where it wasn't just every story that we did. It was at a higher level, only looking at some epics. Use the systems available. We're all communicating. Even now, remotely, we're communicating as a team. So use those. There's a link there for Agile Stationery, who are some awesome people. They will send you decks of cards if you want to send them. If you can't get them printed up yourself. If you do use a deck of cards, there's a 20% discount rate for OWASP members, and there's a 30% discount rate if you buy in bulk. So you can get them through OWASP. You can actually go straight to the OWASP website, download the print templates for the cards, and print them out yourself. But if you can't be bothered to go through that, you can actually just either speak to somebody in your chapter and get them to get some decks sent out to the chapter, or go reach out to Agile Stationery and get your boss to buy you a bunch of decks. They're not that expensive. Agile Stationery also have, this is why I keep tagging them, they also have an open source tool that they use called the Croupier, which the hardest part of dealing with actual cards in your hands when you're doing a remote session is, how do you know who gets which cards? And with the Croupier, you just go plug in a bunch of names. You just plug in name A, B, C, D, E, F, G, however many people you have, and it'll automatically create an output that the Scrum Master who's doing that can then send off to each individual player. Then you, as the individual player, take your deck of cards, you take out the cards that you've been issued for the game session you're going to be playing, and then you have those cards in your hand. And it works really well, because otherwise we've got to try and figure out in-game how to get people cards dealt. And there are also a number of approaches we've taken to doing some digital versions of the game, which have been largely problematic because, well, everything on a screen is hard. Having pieces of paper in your hand that you can shuffle back and forth through seems to work really well. Although I'm still holding out hope that I'll get a mobile version where you can use your mobile phone. So the same concept, the group here will deal out cards and send it to your individuals who signed in with their mobiles to a particular app. But of course, all becomes complicated, and there's a lot to go with that. If you have thoughts on doing some digital stuff, please reach out to me. I'd be really, really keen to collaborate with you on that. It would be quite cool. That is everything I have for you. These are my details again. If you want to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. There's my email address, grant@ongers@owasp.org. or REWTD on Twitter or LinkedIn or pretty much everywhere else. And I know I was supposed to leave this slide up as last that you guys can have, but I do need to show you this slide. I mentioned Adam's 20 years of Stride article. I mentioned the RBI walkthrough video. I'm sure that the slide deck will be made available to you as well. So hopefully you can go and grab the links from here. Yeah, that's me. So there's the OWASP code for the 20% discount, by the way.
Okay,
Assuming
cool.
that everybody watching this is OWASP.
All right. Thank you, Grant. We do, in fact, have a question.
Ooh, excellent.
We've got Veronica Schmidt who's wanting to know, how can this be applied in a waterfall environment and will it translate?
It can definitely translate. You would do it in a waterfall environment. You do it the same way as you would do any other form of threat modeling. So at the beginning, when you're doing the design phase, you'd go through, when you're doing the design aspect of waterfall, you'd go through the threat modeling exercise. The problem with that is that you're going to end up using a lot of time because you're modeling, usually in a waterfall environment, you're modeling fairly large chunks at a time. You probably want to break those chunks up into smaller pieces, into feature sets maybe, to model individually. You just do all the work that you would do in, batches of an hour here or there every 2 weeks. You're going to have to do those batches all up front. And I have seen it done because obviously some of our clients are tied to hardware. So if you're building software, if you're building firmware, then you're very much tied to iteration cycles of hardware. So you have to do a lot of your thinking up front because once they've built the hardware, you can't just, oh, wait, let's add this feature that requires something in the hardware to work. It just doesn't work that way. So there are still a lot of organizations that have to do waterfall. So yeah, break down your big story into manageable chunks so that you're not trying to play this game with all the things at once because you're going to only get so many of the threats out of all the threats that are possible. So break it down into smaller chunks, but do it up front before you start building.
Okay, awesome. Can you quickly go to the contact you slide again so that people know?
Yes.
So
how to get hold of me?
In case there are more questions. Cool. Grant, thank you very much for your talk.
My pleasure.